Good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar all about mastering black and white in Capture One. So thanks for joining us today. If you have any issues watching the stream, just remember you can always refresh at any point. And as I've said, Chrome or Firefox always look the best or always helps with the data that we're trying to stream down as well. So try those browsers if you don't have any luck with Safari, etc. All right, so before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. If you're new to the webinar, my name's David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And as usual, we have a maximum of 60 minutes today. We might not need to use all of that, but that's the longest we're going to run for. Just so you're aware, we are recording the session as well, so don't feel you have to remember everything. You can always watch the recording, which normally goes up on our Learning Hub tomorrow sometime. Now, some of you have found the chat room already. Just be aware that it is public, so anything you say there can be read by all, so be nice to each other and so on. If you want to ask a question, you can do so in the chat. But I might have a better chance of seeing it if you add it to the Q&A as well. It is relatively busy today, so sometimes when the chat messages are flying past, I don't necessarily see all the questions. So you can also ask a question directly in the Q&A tab as well. If you're not interested in chatting or asking questions, that's fine. You can also minimize the chat and the questions area just by tapping on the far right button, or you can float it on a separate window by clicking the button next to that as indicated as well. So I think it's time for us to begin. So let's open up Capture One. And you should be able to see Capture One and myself on screen now. So as I said today, we're learning all about black and white. So what we do is we go through the mechanics of the black and white tool, how that works in particular, and then a bit about adding contrast and clarity, and also using luminosity curves. Then ironically, we'll also have a look at the color editor, as that actually can be used to work with black and white as well, surprisingly. And we do some dodging and burning and a few other bits and pieces as well. So hopefully I'll remember all of that, and you should get something out of today, I'm sure. All right, so let me just hide. And sorry, I muted myself. Yes, I hid myself and muted it as well. That was just one of the scenes. So you should have sound back in a second, and you should be all right. I'm just going to check my feed on the right. Okay, good. We're back. Sorry about that. Yeah, it was my scene switcher. I managed to mute myself as well. I'm just going to check that we're good with me and we're good with the screen. Yes, cool. All right, we're back. Okay, what was I saying? Okay, I was saying that it's sometimes helpful to build your own custom tool tab for working with black and white. So putting in the various different tools that work best for working with black and white shots. So up here in the toolbar, we're going to right click and we're going to say Add Tool Tab. Now this little guy here I'll explain in a minute, but right click and say Add Tool Tab, and we're going to say Custom Tool Tab down the bottom here. So if we click on that, we can give it a name. So let's call it Black and White, and say Add an icon. Let's pick the, what should we go for? Let's pick the trail, why not? And say Add Tab. So that gives me a completely empty tab, which we can then start adding tools for. Now, to explain this is a trial run which shows the various different keys, modifier keys that are being pressed and so on. So please tell me if it's distracting or if it's actually useful. Let's just check what Carl is doing. And 1 second. There we go. Yeah, I'm just going to send a message to Carl. Carl, try using Chrome, like so. All right, so if this little thing is distracting up in the top left-hand corner, but we trialed it this morning and it just helped people to see any shortcuts that are used during the webinar. So if it's distracting, I'll get rid of it. But if it's useful, then please let me know. Okay, so we're going to add some tools. So right click up on my trail here, just move this for a second, and we're going to add our black and white tool, of course. I'm also going to add the basic exposure tool because that's quite useful. And I'm also going to add a curves tool because we're going to look at curves later. And we're also going to add a clarity tool. Where are you? Clarity, like so. And last but not least, let's also throw in some high dynamic range, like so. All right, so now we've got our various different tools which we can use. I'm going to close down curve for now because we're not going to use that. And then we're just going to build up as we go along. Okay, so first of all, let's enable our black and white. Now this shot you can see here, if we just bounce over to the exposure for a minute, it's pretty good exposure. It doesn't need any corrections in that respect. But as we work through some other images, then before we go to black and white, it makes sense to fix exposure and a few other elements first. But this is fine out of the camera. So let's go back to our custom tool tab and enable black and white. Now the image will turn to black and white straight away, but we can control the density of each of those colors with these various different sliders. Now there's no real super scientific way of doing this. It's all about controlling the density. So if we grab the first slider, for example, red, that's probably going to have an effect on the skin tones. So if we go in this way, you can see the skin tones darken. This way, the skin tones lighten, because the skin is made up of reds, yellows, and so on. So with the yellows, a similar thing will happen. The greens, there's probably not much green, just our domino holder down here, cyans, some of the clothing and the signage, and then the blues, once again some clothing, and magenta, not much else. So really these sliders are just about controlling the initial density of the different tones. It's not necessarily a means to control the contrast, but you can control the contrast to some extent with it. So really that's the simplicity of converting to black and white. Now there's a second tab, which is split toning, which if you want to tint a bit of color into the highlights and shadows as well. So that's a simple case of just picking the hue, and then if we drag the saturation slider up, then you can tint the highlights, and then if we went for a different color for the shadows, then we can throw in a different tint for the shadows. So let's reset those, but just so you're aware that if you want a split tone, that's also in the black and white tool as well. It's a good question, Kelly. Should you correct for white balance first of all? You'll see on an image later where we play with the color editor, you can see what effect it has. But if the white balance is way off, I would correct for it. I would correct it, but I wouldn't be too pernickety about it, for example. So in this case, like if we were doing a color shot, then I might spend a bit more time tweaking with the white balance. But as it's ballpark okay, it's not worth playing with it. But when we get to the color editor image, you'll see what influence it can have as well. All right, so next step, we've done our basic color conversion. So we're going to want to add some clarity or contrast. So don't be afraid to use the contrast slider. We'll look at the curves a bit later. but don't be afraid to use the contrast slider directly within Capture One. It does a great job. Like all contrast sliders, you have to use it with a certain amount of care, but you should find it working much better than other raw converters as well. So there is some protection to the shadows and there is some protection to the highlights too. Now, by bumping up the contrast, the only thing I'm worried about here is that the table is getting a bit bright. So we just pull back some detail with the highlight slider, and then I'm going to open up the shadows a tiny bit more just with the shadow slider here, like so. Now, clarity often works really nicely when working with black and white shots. Now, if you don't know the difference with clarity and contrast, is that contrast is going to work over the whole tonal range. So it's going to make our shadows darker, it's going to make our highlights brighter, and also the midtones as well. What clarity does is that it concentrates on the midtones of the image. So there's some protection, there's quite a bit of protection to the shadows and quite a bit of protection to the highlights. So clarity is just working in the midtones, so it can give an image a nice pop, but it won't make those shadows look dark and unpleasant and the highlights too bright, for example. So if we whack in some clarity with this one, then we get a nice result, and we can just tweak this a bit more, but without blocking up our shadows and so on. Okay, so let's have a look at a few questions. I'm just going to type a quick message to Carl, because Carl has left, I think. But as usual, again, if you have issues with the stream coming down, Chrome always works the best. Safari, for many reasons, is not great at handling large chunks of data, because I'm broadcasting in very high quality, so you can see what's going on, and Safari just doesn't seem to cope with that too well. All right, okay, so we're going to look at a couple of questions. First of all, let's see. Oh, happy 4th to Nancy as well. So I saw a question earlier. Are we going to look at any monochromatic shots from achromatic backs? I thought about that. If there's time, we'll look at one. But as I assume most of you probably don't have an achromatic enabled camera, which is one that only shoots black and white. Obviously Phase One makes one, the IQ, but as I imagine not many of you probably have one of those. But if there's time, we have a look at one, because it does behave a little bit differently as well. Okay, I think that's it for questions right now. So let's actually move on and go to the next one. All right. So we know some basics about converting to black and white. It's pretty simple. It's not mystifying at all. So let's grab another shot. What should we go for next? Let's take this one. Nice color shot, as you can see. Now, before we start playing around with black and white on this one, then it makes sense to just fix this slightly, as it's a bit too dark. Now let's look at another trick that you can do, which is in the base characteristics tool. So the base characteristics tool really kind of sets the building blocks of how the image looks in Capture One. In particular, the curve down here. So by default, the curve is set to auto, which generally means we're using a film standard curve, which applies, if you like, a film-like amount of contrast to the shot. Now what we can do is pick something called linear response, and this will give you a much flatter start point, which, if you really want lots of control over the contrast that you want to have in the shot, then linear response could be a way to go. But just a warning, you do have to be, a bit more careful with checking your highlights, making sure they don't get blown out. So we're going to turn our highlight warning on just to keep an eye on that, and just be aware you will get a much flatter start point, so you will have to put a bit more work into getting the right amount of contrast. So we've got linear response enabled. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to crop because I can't quite visualize all the time without cropping, so let's do a slightly better crop, and let's go up to our exposure tool, and we're going to brighten this relatively extensively. If you want to keep an eye on your highlights, don't forget we can turn on highlight warning and shadow warning. And the next thing to do is to set the levels, which is where generally I use the auto function, and that will just drop the shadows and highlight points to either end. So something like that, and that will just give us a good base start for contrast. If you're not sure what that's doing on the levels, all we're really doing is, if you look at the bottom value here, 240, we're asking Capture One to remap that value to the value at the top, which is 255. So right now you can see on this levels display here that we've got missing information there, so that's no information at that point, and we've got very little information here. We can just see it tailing off like so. So what we're looking to do is stretch out that histogram so it runs all the way from shadows to highlights, and that means we get a better start point, that the image isn't too flat. And to be honest, there's nothing wrong with hitting auto in the levels tool. It does a great job. So we've got a better default contrast now. So let's go back to our black and white tool, turn on black and white. Reds, let's see, oh look at that, just the mist on top of the hills. So I'm going to keep my highlight warning on just in case. Yellows is probably going to be the foreground, so I might lift that a bit. Greens, not much going on. Cyans, a bit in the sky. Blue is probably going to have a dramatic effect on the sky, as discovered, and we can just start to see that we need to keep an eye on our shadows there. And magenta, again, not having much going on. So that's a good start point, but it's still a bit flat. So let's add some contrast and a bit of clarity. We can probably keep it on here, and I'll just open up the shadows a tiny bit just to make sure they're not getting blocked up. And now we can look at, well, actually, instead of contrast, let's use the curves. Now you've got two curves at your disposal. So you have the RGB curve and the Luma curve. And the difference between the two is that the Luma curve is only going to affect contrast. Now when using the RGB curve, when you pull different curve shapes and so on, you'll also affect color, and the saturation could go up. Now if you've pulled the black and white sliders back and forth, let's just take blue for example, if I then change the contrast, let's just hide me for a second, if we then change the contrast on the RGB curve, like so, then we're actually changing the saturation on the blue tones, or we're increasing it. So the slider pull you've done in your black and white tool is actually going to have a magnified effect. So that could be bad, or you might not care. But if you want to be completely sort of separating your contrast control away from the controls you've already done with the black and white tool, then you're much better off using the luminosity curve, because that's a pure contrast control only. So it might be somewhat pedantic, but it's probably going to give you a better result in the end. Okay, let's reset the curve, go to Luma, and then we can carefully just dial in the contrast to what we need. So if you're not comfortable with using curves, don't be intimidated. I mean, it's really just shadows to highlights, and you're seeing the tonal range of the image again from shadows to highlights. And essentially we're saying make this tone, say a 3/4 tone, darker, or make this tone here brighter if we go in this direction, or darker if we go in this direction. By default, Capture One will keep the curve nice and smooth, so you don't get any nasty solarization. So it just gives you more personalized control than what the contrast slider would do. Don't be afraid on using the contrast slider, because it still does a great job, but the luminosity curve will just go one stage further and make that even better. Alrighty, so let's zoom in slightly because there's lots of nice detail on this. So what we can also do is go ahead and add a little bit of structure, and what structure will do is just improve the edge definition. So it's kind of like a sharpening, but will just give you nice clear sharp details like we can see in the rocks and so on and so forth. So if we zoom out once more like so, and then let's look at a before and after. So if I hold my Alt key down and click on the reset button, that's how we started, and then if we let go, then we can see after like so. Now the only thing looking at that, I might just open up the shadows a bit more, go back to my black and white, and then drop the blues down ever so slightly just to fine tune. Okay, let's have a look at some of your questions. Let's see. James says, when working with a black and white image and applying grain, is it a good idea to apply the grain only on the background layer or to keep things easily in order? Well, good and bad news for you, James, I would say. You can only use the grain on the background layer, so you don't have any choice. And that's not us sort of being dismissive or whatever. Of course, it might be nice to use the grain on various different layers, but for technical reasons, it's only possible to use it on the background layer. So that choice is made for you, I'm afraid. Okay, let's have a look at some dodging and burning, because that's something which generally works very nicely with black and white shots. So let's see. So dodging and burning, or as I like to call it, brightening and darkening. My photographic career started in the dark room, and it was something we sort of did by nature, and fortunately it's much easier to do it digitally than it is in the dark room, but it kind of gives you that next level up of control of contrast and so on. So the contrast slider is the easiest thing to use. Then you can go for luminosity curves, and then after that we can do some dodging and burning just to really pinpoint and control the different parts of the shot. So let's have a look at this one first of all. So great shot from Chris in Alaska. Happy 4th of July, Chris, if you're watching or not barbecuing. Let's first of all look at this. Exposure wise is pretty spot on. White balance wise, if I was going to treat this as a color image, then I potentially might change the white balance, but I think it's fine. So levels are fine too. I just hit auto just in case. We can pull the shadows in ever so slightly, but out of the camera it's pretty good. So let's go back to black and white, enable black and white like so. Once again, red is probably going to change his skin tones. Green, probably the foliage in the background, so I'm going to darken that right off. Blue, his jacket, so we've got to be mindful that we don't want to darken that down too much. And magenta, again, not a great deal. So you can see in this case these sliders have not so much of an effect, or if they do have an effect, it might not be desirable for the shot. So this way we can use other tools to control our contrast and so on. So it's a bit flat in general, so let's bump up the contrast slider. Already looking better, and same as before, clarity, but not too much. And just bring back some of the highlights because it's a bit bright for my liking just in the middle. So that's good for me, but what I kind of bothers me slightly for this shot is that his right eye, his right eye, or left looking to us, it's slightly darker than his other eye. Not by much, I'm talking 1/8 of a stop or something like that. But in my mind it just needs a little tiny lift, especially if I just darken in general. And also I've got probably a use for the clone tool, which I very rarely use, is to get the catch light in his eye here to his other eye, because it looks kind of weird having a catch light just in one. So I either want to remove one or clone that catch light across to the other. So first of all, let's deal with brightening. So I'm just going to add the layers tool. Brightening the other side. So now working with layers, that essentially means that we can apply an adjustment to just one area of the image by brushing on a mask. Now there's two ways we could do this. I could grab my pen or mouse and we could brush a mask around this area and then play around and try and lighten it and so on. Personally, I think that's not the best technique because you don't get as much control as you might be able to otherwise. So what I like to do first is create an adjustment layer, if you like, very similar to Photoshop. Play around with the adjustments to see how that's going to affect the shot, and then we can brush it in exactly where we need it. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a new field layer. So if we press M on our keyboard, that shows me the mask in red. So it's affecting the whole shot right now. And I want to lighten up this area. So what tools would be good to do that? Probably not exposure, because that's going to lift everything. So probably just a tweak of the shadows would do it. So I'm going to do it more than, or overcook it more than I think, because I'm going to selectively bring it back in to a small amount. So probably that's too much, but we're going to moderate how much we brush back in. So now what we want to do is go to our layer and right click and choose clear mask. So that will clear the mask, but it will keep my underlying adjustment like so. So now what I want to do is grab a brush and I'm going to brush that adjustment back in. Now very importantly, we need to use this slider down here, which is our flow control. And what flow does is change how much of the adjustment you add. Sorry, it disappeared. Let's bring it back. Change how much of the adjustment you add on each brush stroke. So if it's set to 100, let's do that. So we'll change it to 100 and I brush here. Looks kind of crappy because it's putting that whole adjustment in one go. So you've got to be damn sure that the adjustment you made is exactly right. So I didn't have any sort of get out of jail clause for that. It would just put my whole 55 points of shadow recovery in one go. So what we want to do is build it up until you think that looks about right, which is kind of what we did in the darkroom. We sort of exposed the paper, making funny shapes with our hands, checking a watch and thinking, okay, 20 seconds is about right. Then we develop it. That was too much. So then we'd back it off a bit and so on. So we do exactly the same thing, but digitally. So I'm going to undo that. And then this time we're going to right click and put the flow down to something nice and low around 4 or 5. And what that means with each brush stroke or mouse drag, it's going to build up 4%. So it's going to go 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24. So that adjustment goes up nice and slowly. So what we do now is that we just brush back and forth, and then when we think it's about right, we can stop. So now I think that's good. I'm going to stop at that point. Now if you've gone too far, then you can always pick your erase brush or E on the keyboard, and then you can knock it back again. Or if I press B, I've got my brush back and we can brush and so on. Or another sort of element that you've got to play with is the opacity slider. So now I can drag the opacity slider down and see that's with no adjustment, or around here, I'd say, is a nice balance. Now, as I said before, it looks a bit odd that he's got a catch light here and not here. So let's actually clone that catch light in. Now you should name your layers. So let's call that one lighten. Let's make a new, click and hold and choose clone layer. And now that's going to give us something called a repair layer with the clone stamp here. So let's zoom in so we can see what we're doing, because it's going to be a bit fiddlier. And we're going to hold our option key down and then choose our source point, which is this catch light. Let's go over to the other eye going to go even closer, I think, and let's right click and make this brush smaller. And now let's pop a catch light in around something like that, like so. Now if I just go to the hand tool, only thing I need to do is press E for erase. Let's just fix his eyelid slightly, ever so carefully, something like that. And then now when we zoom out, there we go, we got a catch light which looks just that bit better. Now in hindsight I think I might have gone a bit too bright there, but it's easy to go back to that layer and we can just darken off a bit more, like so. So the opacity gives you loads of flexibility essentially to just really retrospectively change what you've done, and you can't do that if you've just whacked in a big adjustment all at once. It's much easier to build it up slowly with flow and then also tweak it with the opacity as well. I might just put in a bit of contrast on that layer as well, because then it will match ever so slightly better. So if I turn off lighten, you can see before and after, ever so subtle, and then repair layer off and on, like so. Now the last thing I want to do is put in a radial mask. So a radial mask is just a fancy term for a vignette. We can use the vignette slider by default, but the radial mask allows you to shape the vignette to something that's maybe more suited to the shot rather than just a basic vignette around the edges of the shot. So let's make a new layer, empty layer, and we're going to grab our draw radial gradient mask tool, go to the center where we start drawing. That will be the center of our radial mask. So let's draw outwards to something like this. Now to rotate it, we just need to hover in the center, and I'm going to rotate it around a bit. And to change the feathering, we can grab the inner or outer circle and then feather this off slightly, and I'm just going to move it over this way a bit. Now once again, if you press M on your keyboard like so, then you can see the vignette that it's created. If we hide the if I bring the mouse off the viewer, then you won't see the radial mask lines. Essentially this is 100%, 50, 0. So that's how the fall off works. And if I go off the viewer again, it disappears. So now I just want to darken that slightly. So let's take the exposure down, and I'll also do brightness, which is just the midtones, because exposure might be a bit too brutal in general. Now if I go back to the background layer, let's just pull in our highlights a bit more. And generally I don't do it, but because this is an environmental portrait, let's actually put a tiny bit of structure in as well, just so we can get all that nice detail out like so. So there we go, finished shot, I think. Let's press C for crop, and let's just go in ever so slightly. Incidentally, if you've upgraded to 12.1 and you're wondering where have my guides gone, there's actually a new tool called guides, funnily enough. It's in the lens tool, sorry, grids I mean. So you can change the kind of grid that you want, the color overlay, whether it follows the crop, different inlays for the various different compositional tools, and so on and so forth. So if we want to see before, let's hold down Alt and click on before and after. It's quite a fitting shot for the 4th of July, I think. All right, let's have a look at the questions. What should you not do when editing black and white? That's a good question. Well, I would say, I think personally, there's always the various different rules, of course, but I think just be mindful that you don't want to have a completely black shadow. So even if we look in the depths of his hat here and we hover the cursor, we've still got some detail like 8, 9, 10 on the RGB scale. If that was pure black, it just tends to look a bit unpleasant, doesn't print too well, and so on and so forth. So that was a good question, Natalie, but I think that's the only thing I would keep an eye on, and the same with highlights. Blown highlights and cluttered up blacks very rarely look good, in my opinion, but others may disagree. What does James say? With clarity, you may wish to compare using the various methods like punch to affect your contrast too. Yeah, that's a good point actually. I wonder if it will have much effect. So my go-to is natural, which is the best combination of clarity, which looks good, which doesn't overdo it too much. What punch does is also bump up saturation a bit, so that might have some effect on the sliders that you've moved in the black and white tool. So if we go to punch, slight difference. So it's just a bit more heavy-handed. But it's a good thing to play with. So it'll probably just exaggerate more the effect that clarity, excuse me, is having. But good question, James. So probably neutral. I doubt there's going to be a huge amount of difference to natural. Tiny bit, and then classic is like a really old algorithm which generally doesn't look that great, but natural is the go-to. Punch will exaggerate the effect a bit more. Okay, let's have a look at the color editor side of things. Where are you? I need this shot from Andrew Ling. So let's hide the browser, let's hide me, and reset this one to color. Okay, so now this one, who was asking, was it Nancy or was it Natalie? I can't remember. Nancy or Natalie, who was asking about the white balance side of things. This is where you will see, you know, quite a big difference retrospectively if we start playing with it. So first of all, let's, I'm just going to crop this. Let's crop so it looks a little bit better, like so. And that should be good. And we need to probably convert to black and white first of all. I'm not going to play around with the exposure too much. It's pretty much spot on, but I can do auto adjustment as well. I can do the auto adjustment too. Okay, so next, let's go to our black and white tool and enable black and white. And first of all, what's interesting is when we get to the blue slider. So let's look at the other tools first of all. Red's probably not going to do much. So yellow is going to change these highlights or warm highlights that you see on the background. So let's make those a bit brighter. And then blue, as you see, is going to change the sky. Now that's a good thing, but if we look at our dude down here at the bottom, he's also wearing a blue jacket. Now I don't necessarily want his jacket to go that dark, because now look at the RGB values, it's now gone down to 0, like so. So timely question from James actually, that well, it wasn't James, sorry. Was it James? No, it was Nancy, I think. Timely question that what we shouldn't do, or Natalie. See, I don't want this to go that dark, but I actually want the blue sky to go that dark. But I can't really do that with the blue slider because it's ruining his jacket. So I'm going to compromise to go somewhere around here. And then we're going to solve the rest with the color editor. So before we get to that, let's have a bit of contrast. Let's have a bit of clarity. And that really makes a nice difference. There's loads of detail going on in this shot. Look at that. So let's have a tiny bit of structure too, so we get all that detail out. And finally, I'm just going to open up the shadows ever so slightly. So now what we want to do, I'm going to bring out the color editor tool just so it's on screen so we can see what's going on. And let's go back to black and white, custom tool tab. So if you recap, or if we recap to remember, if we turn the blue down, then it has a nice effect on the sky, but it's ruining our guy in the blue jacket like so. So we compromised around here somewhere. But I want to make the sky darker. Now, just because we're working in black and white doesn't mean that we can't use the color editor. So if we just turn this off for a second, and then grab our picker in the advanced color editor and then click on the blue sky, and then Capture One's going to suggest to us a range of colors that we're going to edit. Now it's hard to visualize what that actually is, so if we turn on view selected color range, then everything goes to monochrome, which is not part of that selection. So we're really now only affecting the sky, because if we zoom into this guy down here, you can see he's not part of that selection. Now if I was to go out in this direction, we're picking up the greater saturated blues in this range, so it is now part of that. But if we cut that out, then we can remove it like so. So that works really, really nicely. Now in this case, that's probably about right. So then we can turn off view selected color range, and now I can make this darker like so without affecting our guy. Now if we turn black and white back on again, then you can see the effect like so without affecting that. Now if we want to be really careful, I could probably just back this off a bit more as well. So it's really handy actually using the color editor on a black and white, and that's just one example. We could probably do the same. I wonder if we try. Let's grab the color picker and go onto the hillside here and choose that. So that's our warmer tones. Let's turn off black and white just to remind us. And then if we wanted to make that brighter like so, we can lift that up, or we can make it darker. So just because you're working in black and white doesn't mean that you can't play around with the colors as well. So when you run out of options with those sliders, just move over to the color editor and that will work really nicely too. Going back to your questions, let's see. James was asking, as far as the previous question about what not to do, editing, and your point about shadow detail, if 128 is middle grey or zone 5, then approximately reading about 75 would make it zone 3. You know more than me, James, which is traditionally the area in which to preserve the smallest amount of shadow detail. There you go. So I'm going to publish that question so you can all memorize those numbers as well. And what was that? Keith said, what's the difference between natural and neutral? It's very minor, really. Natural, if we just turn off black and white for a second, what you might find when you push clarity too much is you can get some halos around certain areas. Certainly if you use the classic clarity, so you can see it start to haloing around there. So we improved that by building the neutral engine for clarity, and then we improved it further by building the natural engine. So there's very little difference between natural and neutral, except to say that neutral really does the best job. So just play around with it. To be honest, my go-to is always using natural. What Punch does is natural with a bit of a saturation boost, if you like. So Punch is kind of just slightly more aggressive in that respect. Okay, good point from Francis. Sorry, I was going to say Francois there for a second. For output target levels, we tend to use 4 and 250 for images going to printing press. Yes, to maintain some dot, exactly. So what I tend to set on my levels, if we go to the preferences, Capture One's preferences, let's move this over and we go to exposure, you can set where your exposure warnings come in. So based on Francis's advice, we should set to number 4 here and 250 over here, like so. So then we can, that will indicate when you're going outside of those boundaries when we have our highlights and shadow warnings on. So here we're just a little bit too bright in that respect, so we could pull some highlights back a bit more with our highlight slider, like so. So that's good advice from Francis too, because printing full black or not printing anything, as in you need some dot, is definitely good advice. So thanks for that. Okay, how are we doing for time? Probably time for one more, I would think. Let's see what we can play with. Yeah, let's just do one final edit, a very speedy one, and then we shall call it a day. So let's hide my browser, Command R to let's reset this. So I'm going to bring up my crop tool, so that's C on my keyboard. Let's just crop this nice shot down. H to get the hand tool back. And now, first of all, you can see again, this is a really good example of why setting the levels is important, because we've got loads of missing information here, missing information here. So by nature, the image looks a bit on the flat side. So what I'm going to do is carefully tweak the exposure a bit, because we don't want to lose the nice subtle gradation here. And if we say A for auto, there we go. Now this is, I'm guessing, the sun or the moon. It's probably a oh, it's the moon. There we go. So it's a specular highlight, so I can probably get over the fact that that's starting to blow out. And we're at 252 on the red, so it's not disastrously blown out. So that's fine. So let's turn that off for the moment. And look at our midtones. Let's just lift those a bit, because we have quite a lot of shadow in the foreground, but the sky is actually looking quite okay. So we might be able to fix this with a graduated filter. So let's go to black and white. Black and white, turn this on. Now this has some real subtle changes with some of these. So the reds are the hills in the background, but if we go too far we get this weird halo. So I think I'm going to be relatively subtle with those. So cyans are affecting the middle or the midground, and the blues to some extent, and the magentas, look at that, just that kind of halo in between the two. So I don't really want to push any of those too hard, because we're going to get some strange effects, but I could do with brightening up the foreground a bit. So let's open up and make a new layer, and this time we're going to grab our linear gradient mask, draw up from the bottom, and probably do something like this. Now it's symmetric right now, so if I press M on my keyboard, then you'll see how the mask looks. If we want to make it asymmetric, we can hold our Alt key down, and then this way we can have a different kind of fall off from the center line. So that's what we call as asymmetric. So now it will be 150, 0, and then if I wanted to make it asymmetric, then we can do so like that. So you can control that fall off. But I'm going to go something around there. So let's press M on my keyboard, and let's see, I'm just going to lift that exposure up. And if I want to extend that out, let's do that, and just lighten that like so, just so it's a bit more normal. Now the whole image is pretty on the flat side right now, if you like. Oh, I managed to, oh, I didn't reset my levels, because that's our background layer. So let's go back to our background, and now it's pretty flat, so we can probably afford to put in a fair amount of clarity, and then let's use our curves. So let's have a nice heap of clarity. If you want more clarity, we can actually make a new filled layer like so and double up. So we can probably get away with it on this one. So this one was our gradient mask. Always name your layers, remember, grad, and this one was more clarity like so. So you can always add more if you wish, and I think we can get away with that. Background, let's just lift the shadows slightly. And what I might do is also play with the Luma curve, just to get a bit more contrast in there as well. Now if I was to dodge and burn this, what I'd probably do is I want to lift some of the brighter areas a bit, just as a way of changing the contrast to some respect. So if we make a new filled layer, I'm going to call it lighten, and remember it's filled, so we can see the effect by pressing M on the keyboard once more to see the mask. And I want to lighten sort of this area and these areas and so on. Now again, we've got a number of tools to do that. Exposure will probably be a bit brutal. So if we go to our curve, if I hover the mouse over any point, you see the orange line that starts dancing across the curve tool. That's showing me what tonal range that it's currently sitting in. So these areas are sort of mid-tones. So I'm probably going to just grab a point around here and just lift those areas. So now I'm happy with that adjustment. I can right click, clear the mask, grab my brush once again, nice low flow, so down at 4% again, and then we can just selectively lighten like any of these spots. So I'm just going to lighten this mid-ground a little bit, and then maybe some of the stripy bits on the rocks. So around here, like so. So it's quite fun, I personally think, working like this, because you're almost painting on the image and just controlling the contrast in a really specific way. And let's make my brush a bit bigger. I'm just going to lighten up this area along the front and this line here as well. And this line down here too. Now a good tip, if you want to see exactly where your mask is, so if I press M, you can roughly see where it is, but it's a bit hard to visualize. If you look at the grayscale mask, option M, then you can see exactly where you've masked. So that's just giving you that representation. And then M will bring it back, M will hide it, option M, like so, shows you that mask. So quite a nice way to just play around as well. And don't forget, if you've overcooked it or if you think it's too much, you can press E to erase and bring your erase brush back, or B to start brushing again, for example. And if I wanted to do the opposite, I could make a new filled layer once more. Call this darken. So I want to just darken down some of these areas, so I'll pull down the curve like so. Clear that mask, grab a brush, nice big soft one in this case, and then I can custom vignette in a different way if you like. I just want to bring that down a tiny bit, I can do so, and so on. So hours of fun playing around with dodging and burning. And don't forget, of course, you can moderate with the opacity as well. So I'll probably darken that bit down even more. So let's see before. If you hold our Alt key down, we can see before. So that's without any layer stuff, and then with layer stuff, and then Alt key down, and then click on Master Reset. So that was before and after, like so. So let's have a look at your last final questions. Oh, the grain tool. That's a good question, James. Thanks for that. Let's have a look at the grain tool in a second. And Tom, on the earlier mountain shot, the file name mentioned spot removal. Is there a way to find sensor spots that might be in the sky? There isn't a way to automatically detect sensor spots, unfortunately, but that's a really good idea if you could say show spots. On that shot, I think there is one up in the... You're quite right. That was very keen-eyed of you, spotting the file name. I think that there's one lurking up here in the top left-hand corner or something like that. There we go, like so. What I have seen people do is make a layer and then just put some wacky curve on it, and then that way the spots show up better, and then you can just spot and then get rid of that layer. So that would be one way to do it, but there is no visualize spots layer in itself. But we can get rid of this one with the spot. Let's change this to dust, and that's going to be too big, so let's make it smaller, and there we go, we've dust busted. So that could be one way to do it. So that's a good question there, Tom, and well spotted seeing that. Can you increase the highlights or shadows with the color balance tool, David was asking. Yeah, that's a super good question, and you can also triple tone with that as well. So if we go back to our gentleman here, for example, and we go to the color balance tool, color balance like so, and then we can actually throw in a tint in the shadows, midtones. Let's have warmer highlights. Actually looks quite nice. And then with the sliders here in the color balance tool, then we could as well. Just be careful though, you will quite quickly crush the blacks if you're not too careful. So just use that a little bit mindful. And the same for the highlights. Just be a little bit careful that you don't lose out on your highlight and shadow detail. Okay, grain tool to finish off. Grain. By default that's in the details tool tab, but I think I removed it earlier. So let's bring it back, film grain. And we put it next to him and let's zoom in so we can see what's going on. Oops, let's hide our browser. And the cool thing is about the grain tool in Capture One is that most other grain tools, and don't take my word for it, try it out as well, is that they rely on scanning some film stock and then it just does like a straight overlay over the top of the shot. Now that's fine, but that's not how grain behaves in real life. Depending on shadows, midtones and highlights, the grain structure can be a little bit different. So what we did is to look at different mathematical models of how grain works and looks and behaves on film and create 4 or 5 different grain types. Now the first one, which is fine grain, that's like a really old sort of grain model, which just really does add a very fine grain sort of over the whole of the shot. So it doesn't do anything clever in that respect. What the other models do is that they have different kind of grain styles, and then they interact with the image on a much smarter level. My favorite, I hover between soft and cubic grain. So this is the grain shape. And then you have 2 sliders, impact and granularity. So impact is, if you like, the opacity, how visible the grain is compared to the image. And then the granularity is high ISO film or low ISO film. So if we bump up granularity to the max, then it gets really, really grainy. So the first one is how visible that grain is. The second one, how large the grain or granules are, for example. So there's an infinite number of different possibilities. I'm not too keen on the harsh grain myself, but it is representative, very representative of how high-speed film looks, or how some high-speed film looked. So it's definitely worth playing around. There is some presets that you can play with as well, just to give you some inspiration. Extreme and Extreme Plus. So just have a look at those, just to give you an idea of some different patterns, and then you can always, of course, customize to your taste as well. But there's really no right or wrong way to use it as well. Okay, I think that brings us pretty much up, if I check the watch that is correct, yep, up to the final part of the hour. Just let me know in the chat if the little keycaster was useful or not. It's one of those things that could be completely distracting or annoying, or it could be helpful. So it was just some feedback we got recently that it might be helpful to see the shortcuts as well as calling them out. Last few questions. Seth was asking, does the normalize tool work with black and white? I guess it would, but only for the color tone that you're normalizing. So if you imagine a scene with various different colors, and then you normalize a particular color, because you've only really got the choice of one, then it could potentially work, but it's not something that I have tried myself. So it's probably worth an experiment. So, but it could do. It could do. Last few chats. Let's have a look. Kennedy says, Keycaster was nice, but I move it up into that space right above where you had it, between the tool bars but below the menu bar. So what, down here kind of thing, or up there? It's kind of that annoying shape that doesn't really fit into anywhere. So I'll have to experiment on putting it somewhere else, or just not using it. So there we go. But we could put it in an empty spot where there is a space for a tool. That's a good idea. All right, so thanks again for your feedback. I'll leave the chat open for a little bit longer, and hope to see you all again in the next webinar. So there's another one next week on split over 2 days, Wednesday and Thursday, for reasons I won't bore you with. And you can always find those on our Learning Hub, so please sign up, and hope to see you again. So take care, everybody. Enjoy your 4th of July if you're in the USA, and see you again soon. Take care. Bye now.